Can I hold your hand?
Yes. I'm right here.
Can I hold your hand? 5 words that shattered every assumption about power. Here was Silas Mercer, the man who owned half of Manhattan's skyline, who commanded boardrooms with a single glance, asking permission for the most basic human connection. His voice carried a tremor that no amount of wealth could steady, stripped of every defense success had built around him. How do you reach someone who has everything but feels nothing? What happens when achievement becomes your prison and control turns into the very thing keeping love at bay? We tell ourselves that accomplishment will fill the emptiness, that independence will protect us from pain. But what if the very things we chase to feel safe are the exact things keeping us isolated? Tonight, you'll discover how one nurse refused to see a patient file or a net worth statement. How she saw through the fortress of pride to find the wounded soul underneath. How sometimes the most powerful transformations happen when we stop trying to heal ourselves and simply allow someone to witness us in our brokenness without trying to repair what cannot be fixed. Welcome to Love Stories, where we believe the most beautiful connections bloom in the darkest seasons. Whether you're returning to our family or joining us for the first time, you're exactly where you need to be tonight. If you believe love can reach the unreachable, hit that subscribe button right now. We're building a community that believes in second chances and authentic connection. Don't just watch these stories, become part of them. Your subscription tells us you're ready to witness love that defies logic, breaks barriers, and proves that no heart is too guarded to be touched by genuine care. The penthouse felt more like a monument than a home. 40 floors above the city he'd conquered, Silas Mercer sat confined in his wheelchair, staring at glass windows that showed nothing but his own reflection. Every surface gleamed with cold perfection, marble floors that echoed with emptiness, crystal that caught light but no warmth, artwork that cost millions but meant nothing to the man who couldn't feel anything anymore. 18 months had passed since the skiing accident in Aspen. What started as a weekend celebration of closing his biggest merger had ended with one moment of miscalculated risk, one patch of hidden ice, and his world folding in half. The impact that damaged his spine had done something worse. It revealed exactly who remained when the golden boy lost his shine. Rebecca had endured precisely 3 weeks in the hospital. 21 days of visiting hours, where she sat as far from his bed as possible, her diamond engagement ring catching fluorescent light like an accusation. "This isn't what I signed up for," she'd whispered the day she left, placing that ring on his bedside table like evidence of a betrayal. Her heels clicking against the hospital linoleum had echoed finality, the sound of someone walking away from damage they couldn't accept. For the first 6 months after she left, the loneliness had felt sharp and immediate. But as time passed, it transformed into something more insidious, a slow numbness that crept through his days like fog, making everything feel distant and muted. He'd learned to navigate his new reality with mechanical precision, physical therapy appointments, business calls from his home office, meals delivered and consumed without pleasure. The parade of caregivers had become a blur of competent faces and efficient routines. Each one approached him like a problem to be managed rather than a person to be known. They saw his medical chart, his insurance coverage, his progress reports. None of them saw the man who used to find joy in simple pleasures, the perfect espresso, the sound of rain against windows, the weight of a good book in his hands. His empire continued to grow under his remote management, but the satisfaction that once came from closing deals now felt hollow. He could command markets from his wheelchair, influence decisions worth millions with a single email, yet he couldn't remember the last time he'd felt genuinely connected to another human being. The penthouse, that had once been his sanctuary now felt like an elegant prison. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city below, but the glass might as well have been concrete for all the connection it provided to the world beyond. He watched people move through their lives with purpose, while he remained stationary, observing life rather than living it. His reflection in those windows showed a stranger, expensive clothes that hung differently now, eyes that had lost their predatory focus, hands that once controlled millions now gripping wheelchair armrests like lifelines. The city below pulsed with energy while he sat still, watching existence happen beyond glass he couldn't break through. The medical professionals spoke about adaptation and acceptance, about finding new purpose and redefining independence, but none of them addressed the deeper ache, the fear that he'd become someone worth leaving, someone whose value had diminished along with his mobility. He'd built his identity around strength, control, and invulnerability. Without those pillars, he wasn't sure who he was supposed to be. Until 12 months after the accident, when Maren Vale walked through his door carrying something no previous caregiver had brought, the radical idea that he might still be worth knowing, not despite his limitations, but including them. That perhaps healing wasn't about returning to who he'd been before, but about discovering who he might become when someone finally had the courage to stay long enough to find out. She arrived with the possibility that connection didn't require perfection, that love might exist not as a reward for overcoming adversity, but as a companion through it, that maybe, just maybe, he was still deserving of someone's genuine affection, not because of what he could provide or achieve, but simply because he was human and still breathing and still capable of being moved by another person's kindness. She arrived on a Monday morning, 12 months after the accident, carrying the kind of quiet confidence that doesn't announce itself. While every previous caregiver had entered his penthouse with the careful deference of someone stepping into a powerful man's territory, Maren Vale walked in like she was arriving somewhere she intended to be useful. She carried a canvas tote bag over one shoulder, hair escaping from what had started as a practical arrangement, wearing sneakers that had clearly covered real ground. Silas watched from his position by the window as she took in the penthouse, not with the awe he'd grown accustomed to, and not with the careful professional neutrality he'd come to expect. She looked around with something that resembled genuine concern, her gaze lingering on the untouched kitchen, the pristine surfaces that announced a life on pause, the medical equipment that had transformed his home into a facility with expensive furniture. Mr. Mercer. Her voice carried warmth that felt unfamiliar in his cold space. I'm Maren. I'm here to work with you if you'll have me. If you'll have me. Not a corporate introduction or a clinical declaration of purpose. She was asking permission to enter his world rather than assuming access to it. He studied her face with the same precision he used to evaluate business proposals, searching for the familiar signs, the involuntary recoil when taking in his condition, the overcompensating cheerfulness that telegraphed pity dressed as professionalism. What he found instead were steady eyes that seemed genuinely interested in his answer rather than his approval. I don't do small talk, he said flatly. I don't perform gratitude for assistance I didn't request, and I have no interest in anyone's perspective on resilience or positive thinking. Maren set her bag down, deliberately, and met his gaze without flinching. That works for me, because I don't do the arrangement where you pretend everything is manageable, and I pretend to believe you. She moved closer, without the careful distance his previous caregivers had maintained like an unspoken professional boundary. We're going to be honest with each other, or neither of us will get anything worthwhile from this. He said nothing, but something shifted in his attention, a subtle recalibration he hadn't experienced in months. The resistance began almost immediately. He cancelled their first scheduled session using a business call that lasted precisely long enough to expire their appointment window. The following day, he claimed physical exhaustion, though she'd noticed him at his desk through the open office door. The third cancellation involved a physical therapy appointment that his actual therapist later confirmed had never been scheduled. Each time, Maren acknowledged the change without argument, confirmed a new time, and appeared exactly when she said she would. She brought the same unhurried patience to each arrival, as though his resistance was simply whether she was prepared to wait out. She had a particular way of asking questions that bypassed his defenses before he recognized what was happening. While reviewing his medication schedule, she'd ask something unexpected, then continue her work as though the answer didn't matter to her either way. The absence of pressure was precisely what made him want to respond. "What do you miss most about your life before?" she asked one afternoon, not looking up from the notes she was organizing. He watched her for a moment before answering, being touched without it being someone's professional responsibility. She didn't pause, didn't offer a therapeutic response, didn't pivot to something clinical. "That's one of the things we forget to account for," she said simply. "How much we need contact that doesn't mean anything except that someone wanted to reach out." He tried sharper approaches, criticism of her methods, pointed observations about her timing, complaints that her presence disrupted the order he'd built into his days. She received each one without retaliation, but she didn't fold into accommodation either. When he told her she was overstepping her role, she looked at him with something that wasn't quite amusement, but wasn't far from it. "You're putting more effort into removing me than most people put into keeping someone," she said, settling into the chair across from him without being invited. "That's worth thinking about." Her attention moved to the baby grand piano positioned in the corner of the living room, its surface carrying months of settled dust. Someone with that instrument in their home didn't buy it for decoration. "I don't play," he said, his voice carrying the finality of a closed door. "You stopped playing," she replied, the distinction quiet but deliberate. "Those aren't the same thing." She stood and crossed to the piano, drawing one finger along its edge and leaving a clear line through the dust. "Stopping isn't the same as losing. The understanding is still there. It doesn't evaporate because life changed." He watched her move through his space with an ease that should have irritated him. She handled his home like a place where someone actually resided, not a monument to former achievement. "Why are you still coming back?" he asked one afternoon, the question less combative than his earlier ones. "Because you're still here," she said, as though it were the most straightforward answer available. "And someone should be too." The storm arrived during his afternoon routine 3 weeks into her assignment, building steadily until rain hammered the windows in sheets. By early evening, it had settled into something persistent and heavy, filling the penthouse with a pressure that made the space feel smaller. His pain had been compounding throughout the day, the deep, unrelenting discomfort that medications could reduce but never fully quiet. He sat with his shoulders rigid, controlling his breathing with deliberate effort, refusing to let any of it surface. "I'm managing," he said when Maren arrived with his evening medication, before she'd asked anything. She set the medication down and lowered herself to his eye level, kneeling beside his chair. Silas, just his name, spoken with the kind of directness that didn't leave room for performance. "You're allowed to not be managing," she said. "Especially with me. Don't look at me like—" The sentence dissolved before he could finish it. He didn't have language for what he saw in her expression, something that wasn't pity and wasn't professional concern. "Like you're a person who's having a genuinely hard time." Something in his composure gave way, not dramatically, but the way a long-held breath finally releases. She moved to sit on the floor beside his wheelchair, her back against the wall, close enough that her presence registered as warmth without requiring anything from him. "When I was young and frightened of storms," she said, her voice low beneath the sound of the rain, "my grandmother would sit beside me and hum. Old songs, the kind without words, about finding your way when everything feels uncertain. She never tried to explain the storm away. She just stayed until it passed. She remained beside him as the evening deepened, the rain continuing its steady conversation with the windows. She asked for nothing, and offered no solutions, simply present in the difficulty without attempting to resolve it. He didn't speak again that night. But when she finally stood to leave, he looked at her with something new in his expression, not gratitude exactly, and not yet trust. Something earlier than both of those things. The first tentative recognition that her presence in his life might be something other than a professional arrangement. She stayed without needing anything in return, and that, for a man who had spent 18 months measuring every interaction by what it cost him, was the most disorienting thing anyone had done yet. Maren had a particular gift for noticing absence. Not what was present in the penthouse, but what wasn't. The piano bench sat at a perfect angle, positioned by someone who had once approached it daily, now serving no purpose except to hold the memory of a habit abandoned. His phone, which she occasionally saw lighting up with notifications, contained contacts that were entirely professional. She noticed because he once asked her to retrieve a number, and the personal section of his list was nearly empty. The espresso machine on his kitchen counter had been wiped clean of fingerprints, not from recent use, but from the housekeeper's weekly routine. The coffee he'd mentioned preferring hadn't been ordered in months. She said nothing about any of these things directly. Instead, she shifted the texture of her attention without announcing the change. She began arriving with small observations rather than clinical questions, noticing the things that told her more about his interior life than any medical chart could provide. The way his posture changed in the late afternoon, a particular heaviness settling into his shoulders around 4 o'clock. The way he angled his chair toward the city view when he thought the room was empty, as though the distance comforted him. The books stacked beside his chair that he turned face down when she entered, as if reading was something private he wasn't ready to share. The evening it shifted came without warning. She found him in the living room, with a single lamp burning low, the rest of the space filled with shadows that had collected like company. "You've barely eaten today," she said, settling into the chair across from him without making it a medical observation. "My appetite varies." The flatness in his voice was practiced, a tone designed to close conversations efficiently. "Hunger and appetite aren't always the same thing," she replied. "Sometimes what we're actually short of has nothing to do with food." He looked at her with the sharp attention he used when someone surprised him in a meeting. "Is this the part where you tell me what I'm really missing?" "I'm not telling you anything," she said. "I'm just sitting here noticing that you've had every material comfort available to you for 18 months, and you look like someone who hasn't been genuinely seen in all that time. Care and companionship are entirely different things. You've had professional care. That's not the same as someone being glad to be in the same room as you." The question that followed came slowly, as though he was deciding whether to ask it at all. "And you're saying you are glad to be here?" "I'm saying it matters to me whether you ate today, not because it's in my job description." She held his gaze. "There's a difference." The silence that settled between them was different from his usual silences, which functioned as dismissals. This one held something unresolved, something he hadn't yet decided how to handle. "Are you expecting something from me?" The question carried his old defensive register, but underneath it, she could hear the genuine confusion of a man who had learned to treat warmth as a transaction. "I can't be the only source of steadiness in your life if you won't let anyone else in," she said carefully. "That's not a demand. It's just true. One person can't fill the space that isolation creates, and you've been letting isolation do a great deal of work in here." He was quiet for a long time. She didn't fill the silence. "You're the first person since the accident," he said finally, "who hasn't approached me like a problem requiring a solution. Everyone else either wants to fix me or has decided I can't be fixed and left accordingly." "Your situation isn't a problem to solve," she said. "You're a person to know. Those are different assignments entirely. Then why are you still here?" The question came out raw, the professional edge completely gone from it. Genuinely. Why? She considered her answer with the same care she gave everything. "Because you're not someone who's run out of worth. You're someone who's been through something devastating and has been mostly alone in it. That's not a permanent condition. It's a circumstance, and you've had it long enough." He closed his eyes. She watched the muscles in his jaw work against something that wanted to surface. When he opened them again, his expression had lost its managed quality, replaced by something open and unguarded that she suspected few people had ever seen. "I want to believe that," he said quietly. "Then practice believing it," she replied. "You don't have to be certain yet. Just start." The change in their evenings came gradually after that conversation, accumulating in small adjustments that eventually became a new pattern. Instead of Maren preparing his meals while he remained in his office, they began eating together at the long dining table that had gone unused since before the accident. She brought food from places she knew, spreading containers across the marble surface with the casual confidence of someone making a space her own. "Tell me something about yourself," he said one evening. "Something that isn't professional history." She considered for a moment. "I was engaged once. The relationship lasted 4 years. The engagement itself lasted 8 months before I ended it." "What happened?" "He had a specific idea of who I should be," she said, "and it kept getting smaller. He found my work emotionally excessive. He thought caring deeply about patients was a professional liability rather than the point of the profession. He wanted a version of me that was quieter and more contained." She paused. "He wasn't entirely wrong that I bring things home with me, but he was wrong about that being something to correct." Silas watched her as she spoke, reading the steadiness in her voice with the same attention he'd once given to market analysis. "And love? What does that look like to you now? After that?" "Patient," she said without hesitation. "Honest in the uncomfortable moments, not just the easy ones. Present when things are difficult instead of waiting for difficulty to pass." She set down her chopsticks and looked at him directly. "It looks like not making someone else's healing your personal achievement while still genuinely believing they're capable of it. And what does it look like with someone in my situation?" The question came out more directly than he'd intended, bold in a way that surprised even him. "It looks like this," she said simply. Her hand moved to rest on the armrest of his wheelchair, not reaching for contact, just placed there as a marker of proximity. "Two people deciding daily that the other person is worth showing up for. Not just when it's uncomplicated." He looked at her hand on the armrest. "I don't know how to be chosen without wondering what it's going to cost me. Then we figure that out slowly," she said, "without a deadline, without either of us performing for the other." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the city lights shift through the windows. "I'm afraid," he admitted finally. The words came out with the careful precision of someone handling something fragile. "That you'll reach a point where the effort outweighs whatever you see in me. That I'll watch you realize I'm not worth what this requires." Maren didn't rush to reassure him. She let the admission exist in the room for a moment before she responded. "I can't promise you I'll never feel stretched or tired or overwhelmed," she said. "That would be dishonest. But I can promise you that if something shifts, I'll tell you. I won't disappear. I won't leave you trying to figure out what changed. If there's something to say, we'll say it to each other." He looked at her for a long time after that. Not with suspicion, and not with the careful evaluation he'd applied to everything since the accident. He looked at her, the way someone looks at a thing they've stopped believing existed, and then found anyway. "That's the most honest promise anyone has made me," he said. "It's the only kind worth making," she replied. The evening arrived quietly, the way significant moments often do, without announcement or ceremony. They had finished dinner an hour earlier. The containers cleared away. The dining table returned to its usual stillness. Maren had settled into the leather chair with a book, while Silas sat nearby with his tablet, the quarterly reports he'd been reviewing long since forgotten as background noise to the more interesting study of watching her read. She had a particular way of existing in a room that he'd been trying to understand for weeks. She didn't perform comfort or manufacture ease. She simply occupied space with a naturalness that made the penthouse feel, for the first time in 18 months, like somewhere a person actually lived rather than where one survived. "Can I hold your hand?" The question left him before he'd made a conscious decision to ask it. The words landed in the quiet room and stayed there, more vulnerable than anything he'd said in a boardroom negotiation or a hospital consultation. They belonged to someone less defended than the man he'd spent his adult life constructing, someone earlier and more honest than that. Maren looked up from her book. She didn't look surprised, and she didn't look cautious. She looked at him the way she always looked at him, as though whatever he offered was worth receiving. "Yes," she said, and closed the book. She moved to the chair beside his wheelchair and extended her hand between them, palm facing upward. Not a gesture of charity or professional accommodation. An offering between equals. His hand moved toward hers with the deliberateness of someone who understood the weight of what they were doing. His fingers closed around hers carefully at first, registering the warmth and reality of contact freely given. Then his grip settled into something steadier, not tentative anymore but certain, anchored by the simple fact of her choosing to be there. He had been touched regularly for 18 months. Hands that checked his pulse, assessed his reflexes, guided his limbs through prescribed movements. Competent hands, professional hands, hands that performed their function without any exchange of genuine human presence. He had forgotten, until this moment, the difference between being handled and being held. Something fundamental released in his chest, the way a structure under long-term pressure finally finds equilibrium. Her thumb moved in slow circles across his knuckles, unhurried, as though she had no intention of being anywhere else. "Thank you," he said after a while. "For what specifically?" "For making me feel like a person worth reaching for." She didn't deflect the words or minimize them. She simply held his hand a little more securely and let what he'd said exist between them, without requiring anything added to it. Contact became the language they used when words felt insufficient. Her hand settling on his shoulder during the physical therapy sessions that left him exhausted and frustrated, a steady presence that communicated solidarity without commentary. Her fingers brushing across his forehead on the evenings when sleep refused to come and pain made the nights feel interminable, her touch carrying something that no prescription had managed to provide. She treated his body with a respect that went beyond professional competence. When she assisted with his transfers, her movements were firm and unhurried, handling him like someone whose physical dignity mattered as much as their medical needs. There was no performance of cheerfulness in these moments. No compensatory brightness designed to offset discomfort. Just straightforward, respectful assistance between two people who had established enough trust to navigate difficulty together. The hardest afternoon came 6 weeks into her assignment. His physical therapy session had compounded an already difficult day, and his coordination had failed him repeatedly in ways that left him feeling hollowed out. When the therapist left, he sat in his wheelchair in the center of the living room and stared at nothing in particular. "I hate requiring help with things that used to be automatic," he said when Maren came in. His voice was flat with exhaustion. "I hate that you have to witness this version of me and pretend it isn't diminished." She crossed the room and knelt beside his chair, level with him. "You are not a diminished version of yourself," she said, her voice carrying none of the therapeutic brightness he'd learned to distrust. "You're a person navigating a genuinely difficult situation, and people assist each other through difficult situations. That's not charity. That's just what human beings do when they decide someone matters. What if one day you reach the limit of what you can give?" he asked. The fear beneath the question was audible, stripped of its usual professional coating. "Then I tell you," she said, directly and honestly before it becomes a problem. "I don't accumulate resentment quietly and then disappear. I don't leave you managing the fallout of a decision you didn't know was coming." She held his gaze steadily. "Whatever happens between us, you will not be left guessing." He absorbed this. The promise wasn't dramatic or elaborate. It was the promise of basic decency, of being treated as someone whose experience of abandonment mattered. And somehow, coming from her, it was the most substantial thing anyone had offered him. "I've never had that," he said quietly. "Someone who stayed and told the truth at the same time." "You have it now," she said, "whether it feels real to you yet or not." 7 weeks after Maren's first day, Silas rolled his wheelchair across the living room to the baby grand piano. He did it without announcing his intention, without asking anyone's permission, and without fully understanding why this particular afternoon felt different from the hundreds that had preceded it. The keys were clean now. Maren had dusted the instrument weeks ago without comment, a small act that had registered without either of them acknowledging it. He positioned himself at the keyboard and sat for a moment with his hands in his lap, looking at the ivory and ebony as though reintroducing himself to an old relationship. Maren appeared in the doorway from the kitchen and stopped. She read the moment correctly and remained where she was, neither advancing nor retreating, simply present at the edge of something that belonged to him. His hands moved to the keys. The first notes of a Chopin nocturne emerged slowly, shaped by fingers that remembered the music even when the technique was no longer what it had been. His timing was imperfect. His control was inconsistent. There were pauses where the melody should have flowed, and moments where his hands didn't respond with their former precision. The music was honest in the way that imperfect things often are. It didn't pretend to be what it once was, and that made it something different, and perhaps more truthful than the flawless performances he'd once given. When the final note dissolved into the room's quiet, he sat with his hands still on the keys. "That was beautiful," Maren said from the doorway. "It was imprecise," he replied. "It was alive." She moved into the room slowly, stopping beside his chair. "Precision is a technical quality. What you just played had something that precision alone can't produce." He looked at his hands on the keys. "I wasn't sure I could still do it." "You didn't lose the music," she said. "You lost access to it for a while. Those are different things." He turned to look at her, and something in the quality of his attention had shifted from every previous moment between them. He raised his hand slowly and held it near her face, the gesture carrying its own question. She answered by leaning into his palm, her eyes closing as his hand curved against her cheek. The city continued its indifferent activity beyond the windows. The afternoon light crossed the room at its gradual angle. Neither of them moved for a long moment, both present in the simplicity of contact chosen freely by two people who understood what it had cost to arrive here. "Stay," he said. The word carried the full weight of everything the two of them had built across 7 weeks of honest, difficult, patient work. She brought both her hands up to cover his where it rested against her face. "I'm here," she said, "and I'm not going anywhere in the dark." Not anymore. He kept his hand against her cheek and looked at her with the expression of someone who has stopped bracing for loss. "I think I've been falling in love with you," he said. "I didn't recognize it at first, because it didn't feel like what I thought love was supposed to feel like." "What did you think it was supposed to feel like?" "Urgent," he said. "Like something you had to secure before it disappeared." He paused. "This feels different. It feels like something that's been building a foundation instead of demanding one already be there." Maren smiled, and the expression reached everything in her face. "That's exactly what it's been doing," she said. "And I've been building alongside you the entire time. Let me be honest with you about something before we close out this story, because Silas and Maren's journey deserves more than a comfortable ending wrapped in sentiment. Love did not eliminate Silas's difficult days. The mornings still came when his body reminded him of everything that had permanently changed. The wheelchair remained a daily reality, not a temporary inconvenience on the way back to his former life. The memories of who he'd been before the accident didn't fade. They simply stopped being the standard against which he measured his current worth. What changed was the interior landscape, the way he moved through his own life, the story he told himself about what he deserved and what was still possible. Maren didn't save him. That distinction matters enormously, because the version of this story where one person rescues another does a disservice to both of them. What she did was more demanding and more generous than rescue. She showed up consistently, told the truth reliably, and refused to treat his lowest point as his defining characteristic. She held space for his healing without making his recovery her personal achievement. And he met her there. That part is equally important. He chose, repeatedly, and against the resistance of 18 months of accumulated pain, to remain open when closing down would have been easier. He asked for her hand when asking felt impossible. He sat at the piano when silence felt safer. He admitted fear when pride would have been more familiar. Being strong, he discovered, had never meant needing nothing. It meant having the courage to identify what you genuinely needed and allowing the right person to know it. The billionaire who had constructed his identity around self-sufficiency learned that the most significant thing he could offer another person wasn't his resources or his accomplishments. It was his honest, undefended presence, the version of himself that existed before the performance began. And Maren, who had spent years in a relationship that asked her to be smaller, found in Silas someone who had learned, through genuine difficulty, to value exactly what her previous partner had wanted to diminish: her capacity for deep attention, her refusal to look away from hard things, her understanding that staying present in someone's pain is not the same as being destroyed by it. This is what love looked like between them. Not the dramatic declaration or the grand redemptive gesture. It looked like dinner at a table that hadn't been used in a year and a half. It looked like a hand extended palm upward in the evening quiet. It looked like music played imperfectly in an empty room while someone stood in a doorway and understood what they were witnessing. Here is what their story offers anyone willing to receive it. The structures we build around ourselves after being hurt are not signs of strength. They are signs that we were injured and did what we could to prevent further damage. Recognizing the difference between protection and imprisonment is one of the most honest things a person can do for themselves. Allowing yourself to be genuinely known by another person, not the curated version, not the recovered version, not the version that has resolved all its complications, is not a weakness. It is the specific kind of courage that makes real connection possible. Everything else is just proximity. The right person will not require you to be whole before they decide you're worth knowing. They will be interested in you as you actually are, in the present tense, with all the unresolved difficulty that entails. And when you find that person, the evidence won't be in what they say during the easy moments. It will be in what they do when things are hard and staying requires something real from them. True wealth, the kind that Silas spent 18 months discovering he didn't have, cannot be generated by achievement or accumulated by success. It exists in the quality of what remains when everything external has been stripped away. It lives in who stays when staying costs something. It grows in the space between two people who have decided, without guarantee or certainty, that the other person is worth the risk of being known. If this story reached something real in you today, I want you to do 3 things. Smash that like button, because it tells us that these stories matter and helps more people find their way to this community. Share this with someone in your life who needs to be reminded that their hardest season is not their final one. And subscribe to Love Stories with Mr. Tyrell so you never miss the stories we bring you every single week. Remember this as you go about your day. Love does not arrive when you have successfully hidden everything that makes you feel unworthy of it. Love arrives when you finally stop hiding and let someone see the actual version of you, the one that exists before the performance, behind the achievement, beneath the armor. Until next time, this is Mr. Tyrell reminding you that someone out there is not looking for your perfect version. They are looking for your real one. Stay blessed.